Don't listen to the rubbish that is being put out on Russian media. The media have a really strong role in this.
То есть свобода слова, она инструмент в руках тем, кто использует ее, вам так не кажется?
The Russians have used their media as an instrument of war.
Поговорим про экологию.
I'm not saying that the Aral Sea is not important, but it's not the whole story. My message for a long time here, ever since I arrived, has been your biggest challenge now is what's happening in the mountains from which you get your water.
Принципиально, как мне кажется, мало что поменялось в Министерстве народного образования.
I think there are still lots of problems. I think there's still, as everyone acknowledges, there's still a lot of corruption in the education system. I'm not sure we'd have been doing this interview 6 years ago.
Давайте поговорим про мою любимую часть, о которой всегда говорит западное сообщество – свобода слова. Как вы оцениваете в целом ситуацию со свободой слова в Узбекистане? Максимально искренне, если можно.
I think in many ways freedom of expression, media freedom have been one of the real achievements of the reform process here. I'm not sure we'd have been doing this interview 6 years ago. And if we had been, you'd have been asking me different questions and I would have been giving you different answers.
That's true.
It wouldn't last as long. And that's just a really potent symbol of how things have changed. I think that the emergence of a vibrant blogosphere here is a huge change. Social media have real downsides as well as real upsides, and I think we're all, the world, not just here, are having to learn to deal with that. The emergence of a truly independent media, and I make a distinction between the bloggers and the media, although it's a fine line between them, is really encouraging here. So you've seen some great independent journalists coming up. You've seen interesting online media, the sort of Kundotuz, Gazeta.uz, sort of the online news agencies and things like that is really encouraging, and they've got a vital part to play in the media's role in all of the reform process that we've talked about, telling the truth, exposing the good things and the bad things that go on in this country, holding government to account, but also allowing government successfully to communicate with the people about what they're trying to do, and encouraging a real debate with government. So I think there's some really good things. I think release of journalists who are being held as political prisoners early on has been really encouraging. But that's not to say that there is complete freedom of the media and freedom of expression in this country yet. And if I'm honest, I think that it's been one of the areas which, if anything, has gone backwards in the last 2 years in this country. And there's still good things. We're still having this interview, but I think that, and I'm unsure whether, I don't think that's necessarily government, but I think that what's emerged is quite a nasty blogosphere, so that there's the sort of online attacks on free-thinking journalists, for example, has not been helpful. I think that there are still issues which journalists and bloggers feel uncomfortable talking about. We're seeing harassment of journalists, and including physical violence. Bloggers are not necessarily controversial, but one of the things that happens when you create a blogosphere is that it creates a space for people to have strong views on all sides of the political spectrum. But what it also produces is a lot of very nasty hate speech and cyberbullying and things like that, which is really nasty and unacceptable. Our legislators need to be working how we deal with that. But it's not necessarily by restricting the freedom of expression. But we're all wrestling with that. The relationship between security, particularly violent extremism, and free media is an active debate, a really difficult debate in any country in the world.
По-вашему, что такое оптимальный уровень свободы слова? Есть ли какой-то пример?
I do have a view on that. I think that optimally, we ought to be able to say fearlessly and without fear of intimidation or harassment what we believe to be true, and to argue powerfully in a public space, advocate that to others as well, and conversely, to be allowed to disagree. There is a line beyond which that is not acceptable, where you are encouraging violence, you're inciting violence or inciting hatred, particularly against parts of our societies that are less able to defend themselves. So it could be incitement to racial hatred or ethnic hatred or religious hatred. But you have to do that through legislation. You have to define what that means in legislation and use the courts to defend, to examine where that line is. Those are active debates that we're doing at the moment.
Нет ли в этом такой легкой иронии, что вот западное общество, которое действительно несет такое понятие, как свобода слова, сейчас, собственно, ограничивают те же самые понятия свободы слова, скажем, в отношении России, когда российские СМИ блокируются, информация подается однобоко и так далее, и так далее. Меня сложно заподозрить к любви к России, к действиям Российской Федерации, но тем не менее, нет ли в этом странностей?
Well, first of all, I don't accept that we put restrictions on freedom of speech. I think that other than the legal, legislative ones to prevent incitement to violence and racial hatred and the other and terrorism, for example, I don't accept that we do that. I think Russia is a very particular case at the moment, and we are acting in the face of unprovoked, brutal, appalling invasion of a sovereign territory, where the fundamental basis that has been done is just complete falsehoods. The Russians have used their media as an instrument of war in a way that is completely unacceptable to any fair-minded society. So what we are doing in the specific case of the Russian media is placing not unreasonable restrictions on what they can do. It doesn't stop them. We're not closing down the Russian media, but we are taking firm action to ensure that they don't become part of the weapons of war that are.
Это немного однобоко, мне кажется. Есть одна сторона, есть другая сторона. То есть, если мы говорим про свободу слова, если мы говорим про возможность общаться, делиться своими, скажем, мнениями, разными способами, сейчас мы видим, что Россию, по сути, отключают от информационного поля, и они остаются там внутри со своими средствами массовой информации.
This is a country which is imposing swinging restrictions on its own people and on its own media who publish news that might in any way contradict what the official narrative is. So we are not in this is an extraordinary situation. The way that the Russians have used the media in this is invidious and outrageous, disgraceful, because they are concocting a conflict which is it's completely unjustified and unprovoked in a very nasty, premeditated way.
Я побуду немного ватником, то есть патриотом, скажем, России, хотя я не являюсь. Все то же самое делал Запад в свое время. Это вот эта знаменитая история с 33 странами, когда США, включая НАТО, бомбили другие страны, Афганистан, Сирия, Ирак и так далее, так далее. То есть ничего такого в СМИ не было на самом деле. То есть свобода слова, она инструмент в руках тем, кто использует ее, вам так не кажется?
I lived in Ukraine for at the end of 2018 and the beginning of 2019. And I was there to learn Russian because it was difficult at the time, for different reasons. It was difficult for diplomats to be studying in Russia itself. So I was deeply ingrained. I was living with a family, a Russian-speaking family in Ukraine. I traveled quite a lot. I was using Russian to be able to find my way around. And the fiction that is being created to justify this invasion is completely different from the country that I saw and tried to learn the language in. And the language and the Russian-speaking communities in that country have become the main reason, the main justification for a war which has got nothing to do with that at all. It's all about President Putin's ambitions to recreate the Soviet Union by reacquiring parts of that. And that should be worrying to Russian-speaking communities all over the Soviet Union, because what you're doing is seeing a president who has a vision of a country which he's using the language and using the fact of a former sort of Russian empire to justify and just watching what is going on, watching the bombardments, watching the attacks on cities, watching the faces of the people that are having to leave, the nearly 3 million people who've been displaced by this war already in Ukraine, watching all of that, watching that on a free media, watching that through the eyes of journalists who are talking to the people on the ground, who are bravely talking to the people who are working in these so-called biological hospitals that are health facilities, pharmaceutical research establishments that we have helped together to build, that have worked there, have actually talked to the Uzbeks that have worked there. Go and find them, talk to get the realities of all of this. Don't listen to the rubbish that is being put out on Russian media. The media have a real role, a really strong role in this, and a strong role to tell the truth. I know enough about the robust role that I can only talk about British media, or the British media have the way they hold me to account for what I do, the way you're doing now, that to know that these are not people who are propagandists, these are not people who are doing what they're told to do by a government. It is a completely different vision of what the media does to the as you're seeing from the journalists walking out of Pervi Canal of RT at the moment. They're saying the truth about the Russian media at the moment. We're reliant on a free press. We're reliant on great journalism to expose the truth of what's going on now. And I encourage everyone to watch a diversity of different views as far as it's possible to do. But online has made access to this so much easier, except in Russia, where even with VPNs you can't do it.
О чем же еще говорить в рекламной интеграции в выпуске с послом Великобритании? Ну, конечно же, о Кембриджской международной школе CIS Ташкент. Школа является частью официально аккредитованной сети школ Cambridge Assessment. Они получают аккредитацию в Кембридже, в том самом Великобритании. CIS Ташкент – это качественное образование и органичное развитие личности. Школа принимает детей от 2 до 18 лет и готовит выпускников с дипломами Cambridge IGCSE. AS and A Level. Кембриджская программа преподается высококвалифицированными учителями-носителями языка из Великобритании, США, ЮАР, Канады и Австралии. В каждом классе учатся не более 20 человек, что позволяет учителям найти индивидуальный подход к каждому ученику. Также здесь есть программа ценностного образования Values-Based Education, которая обучает детей общечеловеческим ценностям и помогает ученикам школы становиться гражданами мира. Большой выбор внешкольных кружков, таких как футбол, теннис, клуб журналистики, модель ООН, гитара, фехтование, регби, стрельба из лука, музыка, робототехника, программирование, клуб дебатов, настольный теннис, киноклуб и множество других. В школе обучается около 20 национальностей, что позволяет ребятам погрузиться в международную среду для обмена культурными ценностями. Ну и, конечно же, можно выбрать разные языки обучения, например, китайский, испанский или французский. Пройдите бесплатное вступительное тестирование уже сегодня, причем по промокоду AlterEgo это можно сделать совершенно бесплатно. Без промокода это стоит 600 тысяч сумм. Вся дополнительная информация по ссылке в описании, ну и по телефону 71 209 6669. США, Евросоюз, Великобритания вводят жесткие санкции. Да, об этом, я думаю, что не стоит... Все об этом знают, да, против России. С российского рынка массово уходят компании, в том числе и британские. Но от этого страдают в большей степени простые люди, нежели чем Владимир Путин и его окружение. Как вы думаете, насколько это справедливо в целом?
Sanctions will hurt, and we know that. It's a response to the catastrophic, appalling invasion that we've seen. We have no issue with the Russian people, with whom we enjoy, genuinely, we have no issue with the Russian people. Our issue is with President Putin and his regime. In our sanctions, we have tried really hard to target President Putin and his. So we've now imposed sanctions against over 1,000 Putin's immediate political entourage and the oligarchs, the big business people who have supported his hold on power. That is a vitally important part of what we do. That's been the first measure that we took. We have taken measures to hit the Russian economy hard, to stop the use of energy resources, for example, but resources of state enterprises from fueling the war effort, to make the opinion formers in Russia aware of the economic consequences of what President Putin has decided to do. And of course, that is deliberate. We want Russia to think twice about what President Putin has decided to do against a sovereign, democratic, independent country.
Но, тем не менее, это бьет, опять-таки, по простым людям. Вряд ли это сильно бьет по Путину от того, что там у Усманова забрали яхту, у кого-то еще забрали яхту, дворец какой-то. Страдают же обычные российские граждане.
Oh, it hurts the oligarchs hard. The Russian people are affected by a downturn in the economy. And we recognize also that that has consequences beyond Russia. But we are seeing already just the impact it's having on the leadership. The sanctions are already starting to work. The consequences for the Russian economy are really stark. And we will see in the future. I can't tell how President Putin will decide to respond to that. Be under no doubt that what he is doing has real consequences for the economy of the country.
Не приведет ли это, как вы думаете, к тому, что санкции, наоборот, усилят Россию, как это было с Ираком? Режим в Ираке укрепился благодаря санкциям, режим в Иране укрепился благодаря санкциям. Тот же самый путинский режим, опять-таки, может укрепиться. Нет ли таких мыслей?
I would be very surprised if President Putin's hold on power is stronger as a result of what he's doing without extraordinary repression in Russia. And I'm afraid you're already starting to see that extraordinary repression in Russia, the sort of complete clampdown on independent media, preventing people access to the outside world through VPNs, through the internet, detention of the thousands of people demonstrating against the war. What happened to the Первый канал journalist who protested on camera? That is not a freedom-loving first world society. This is a repressive regime which is putting in place further repression. And ultimately, I hope, I pray that this doesn't last, because the impact on a sovereign state on the southern border, an independent sovereign state with a strong pride in its own nationality, in its own language, in its own history, and its own culture, suddenly to be just invaded and subsumed and its people killed or driven out of the country and its institutions and its infrastructure destroyed. That's not, in the modern world, that is unacceptable.
Всем привет еще раз! Знаете, что это? Это мультикарт, пропуск в экосистему, который позволяет делать ваши финансовые операции более выгодными. А еще это простое и удобное приложение и, конечно же, настоящая банковская карта, которая позволяет делать возможности этого самого приложения шире. Давайте расскажу о ней. Во-первых, это кэшбэк. Оплачивая покупки в быстро растущей сети партнеров сервиса, вы получаете кэшбэк до 20%. Например, тут или тут. Все они указаны в приложении в удобном каталоге с локацией, фотографиями и описанием. Здесь можно найти также кафе, рестораны, фастфуд, магазины одежды, товары для дома и многое-многое-многое другое. Переходите и изучайте. Просто платите картой мультикарт, и часть суммы автоматически придет вам на карту обратно. Во-вторых, через приложение мультикарт можно получить выгодную беспроцентную рассрочку на срок от 3 до 6 месяцев. Скачайте приложение, пройдите онлайн-идентификацию и добавьте зарплатную карту. После проведения скоринга вам выделят кредитный лимит, в рамках которого можно приобретать товары в рассрочку. Весь процесс проходит без заявок и проверок со стороны человека и занимает буквально 5 минут. Мультикарт можно получить рассрочку на все необходимое, от одежды и детских игрушек до мебели и бытовой техники. В-третьих, у мультикарт есть все функции стандартного пластика, такие, например, как возможность оплаты или же снятия наличных. При совместном использовании карты и приложения вы можете пополнять ее с других карт абсолютно без комиссий и ограничений. А переводы с мультикарт на другие карты Узкарт или Хумо будут вам стоить всего лишь по 0,3%. Само собой, карту, конечно же, можно пополнять наличными в банкоматах Хумо, локации которых указаны в приложении на карте. Ну и, конечно же, фишки. Бесконтактная оплата проезда в метро и автобусах, возможность распределять расходы по категориям, возможность отслеживать, на какие цели вы тратите больше всего денег за отчетный период. Через приложение можно заблокировать карту, ну или разблокировать после неверного введенного пин-кода в терминале, или же восстановить пин. Со смартфоном на Android с поддержкой NFC можно оплачивать товары и услуги с помощью прикосновения телефона к терминалу даже без карты. Думаю, что вы знаете об этой услуге, мои современные. Установить приложение и зарегистрироваться в нем может уже сейчас любой желающий по ссылке в описании. Карту же можно заказать через приложение за пару кликов, и через несколько дней вам ее доставят совершенно бесплатно в любую точку Ташкента. Мультикарт – это круто! Недавно член парламента Маргарет Ходж призвала ввести санкции против Казахстана за поддержку России. Насколько это справедливо, опять-таки? То есть почему и будет ли, если Узбекистан поддержит Россию в чем-то? Могут ли санкции коснуться и нашей страны, как вы думаете?
First of all, Margaret Hodge is an MP, a member of parliament. She's a Labour MP, so she's not part of the government. The government has made very clear since that we are not going to take sanctions against Kazakhstan. In very short, that is the case with Uzbekistan also. Uzbekistan is in a difficult position. It has taken a sort of balanced, neutral stance on this.
Как вы к этому относитесь, кстати?
I think every country has to develop its own approach on this. We have talked privately in my conversations with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we've had a number of conversations, and I have another one tomorrow to talk about Ukraine and listen to viewpoints. I hope very much that the strong relationship that this country has developed over the last 5 years with Russia, I think one of the, in many ways, good things that President Mirziyoyev has done in his foreign policy is to actually develop a relationship of genuine dialogue with President Putin, and I hope that is being used to convey privately some of the very real misgivings that this country feels about what is going on in Ukraine at the moment. But I also understand that this is a country which has a very strong trading relationship with Russia, has a people-to-people links, however many, 2, 3, 4 million Uzbeks working in Russia at the moment. Of course we understand that. And part of being good diplomats is being able to say privately to friends things that you would be quite careful about saying publicly. And I hope very much that that's going on.
18 февраля исполнилось 30 лет с установления дипломатических отношений между Узбекистаном и Великобританией. Если бы мы были, наверное, на государственном телевидении, мы бы сказали, что успешного произошло. Расскажите про успех. Но так как мы не с ГосТВ, я хотел бы вас спросить про то, что не получилось сделать. Возможно, о каких-то ошибках, возможно, что нам еще предстоит сделать.
I'd answer the same if I was answering this question on national television as well. I think all of that, though, is work in progress. And I think, on the economic front, there is more to be done in terms of opening up, of diversifying markets, more to be done in tackling issues around corruption and the rule of law, which will encourage foreign investment, encourage fair competition between Uzbek companies in Uzbekistan. I think that's the big thing, one of the biggest challenges that this country still faces is tackling corruption and a judicial system which is not as transparent as it might be, as equitable as it might be. On the human rights front, we talked about the good things that have happened, but I think I would add to that, actually, there is a much more interesting, vibrant media environment here than there was 5 years ago. But again, there are still real constraints on the media. There's still a long way to come. There's a lot of capacity building to be done, I think, as well. I think the media themselves have still got a way to come, and the environment is not a friendly one. I think coming from a society in the UK where we have incredibly strong civil society, so strong people's organisations, strong interest groups, strong trade unions, very strong, vibrant academic research community. I think there's so much more that can happen here. And I noticed the President's commitment to do that in recent speeches, but I think that's going to be vital for the economic development, the social development of this country. The big things, I think, are justice and reform, tackling corruption, the growth of civil society particularly, and more on media freedom.
По-вашему, что мешает провести судебные реформы в полной мере? Вернее, это, наверное, одна из самых таких важных частей, но пока на нее, мне кажется, особого внимания не уделяется. Или в чем проблема? Вам, как дипломату, в чем видится?
I don't know is the short answer to that question. I think there are various component parts to that. Part of it is just the administration of justice and access to the courts. There are some solutions which I know that the Ministry of Justice have started working on digitalisation, which take people out of the equation, and that's very important. So access to justice. The administration of the court system is important. I think that you need people in the judicial system, whether it's from judges down to the court officials to others who are acting in the best interests of the population and of communities and not necessarily in their own. And that's difficult to do because it's a cultural change. It's got to do with the way you recruit your personnel. It's got to do with the way that you check their probity and integrity, the sorts of security checks that we would require in the UK, for example, and that's starting to happen. The Anti-Corruption Agency is working on that. I think you need to, a country, and this is the talking in more general terms, need to ensure that there is genuine ring fencing of the judicial system away from national and local politics, away from business interests, so that the judiciary can take their decisions in a completely fearless, free, transparent way. I think the whole process needs to be more robust in terms of investigation of crime and the way that the prosecutions take place. So the ability to ensure that this is still a country where there are too many allegations of torture in the investigation of crime, for example. And I know that as a government, this country is committed to rooting that out, but it's still there. So there are a host of component parts to it. Don't interpret that necessarily as a criticism. It is work in progress, but there are things that need to happen. And nowhere is that, in no society in the world is that completely absent. Mm-hmm. You just have to have robust machinery to make sure that when things go wrong, they're properly investigated, that they are tackled and prosecuted, and people are punished where they've made mistakes. And that implies to the judiciary and court officials who have a responsibility and a vital role.
Отсутствие реформ в судебной системе является ли одной из причин того, что, допустим, те же самые британские инвесторы не особо охотно заходят в Узбекистан?
It's very sad, first of all. One of the jobs of British Embassy in Tashkent is to try to encourage more British businesses, not just investors, but exporters and a lot of modern industry it needs partnerships, it needs companies working together, and
это пока этого не происходит, тем не менее.
I'd like to see much more of that, and this is a country which deserves more attention from Britain. And one of the failures of the embassy is that we haven't managed to make that happen as much as we should do, and it's justified. But there are all sorts of reasons. I think the judicial system is part of it, but I think also that our businessmen and our investors are perhaps looking for safer, more familiar options. This is not a part of the world that we know very well, so we need to expose British business to the opportunities that are here, and that's the Uzbek Embassy in London's job, it's the British Embassy in Tashkent's job, it's the business community itself. It's not just a judicial environment. I think it's been a difficult time for British business also over the last little while because we've had to adjust to big changes in our relationship with Europe, for example, over the last little while. And so it'll take us a while to start looking for new markets where Uzbekistan might figure.
Вы много общаетесь, я так понимаю, с разными министерствами, с нашими узбекскими. Какое из министерств наиболее открытое, наиболее действительно искренне выполняет свою работу хорошо, по-вашему?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to completely answer it. I think I'll answer it in a different way, which is that I think inevitably the ministries with which we've had the most dealings and who have been open with us are the ministries with which the British connection is the strongest. Obviously, the ministry that I speak to most is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but we deal also a lot with ministries of investment and foreign trade, with education, the various education ministries, particularly public education and higher and specialised secondary education. We have a particularly strong relationship with the Ministry of Justice as well, because Britain has worked very closely with the Ministry of Justice on the implementation of the reform process here. I've probably missed ministries out that we're dealing with, but I don't think I'm not going to do a competition of who's best and who's not. I think we've enjoyed a close relationship with the ministries that most have impact on our relationship.
Поясню, почему спросил, потому что когда бывшего министра народного образования Шерзоде Шерматова перевели в Министерство по развитию ИКТ, вы сказали, что потеряли великолепного партнера в сфере образования. Можете, по вашему мнению, описать кратко, в чем его достижение? В чем он был хорош?
Yeah, whether it's different or not, I don't know. I think it's that we did have a good relationship with Minister Shermatov because I think, first of all, the education sector is one where Britain has a huge presence in this country. I think you see it most evidently in some of the links between Uzbek institutions and British institutions, particularly at tertiary level, so that Westminster University is the most obvious example, but there are now dozens of British universities who have some form of partnership arrangement with Uzbek universities, where the British education system, both university and school, is very highly regarded in this country, and it's still a really important destination for Uzbek students studying overseas, and it is valued as a truly world-class quality education which serves well the young people of this country, and I'm very grateful for that. I think you're right. We do have really, truly world-class universities and schools producing astonishingly talented, capable young people who will transform the economies of the world, the politics of the world, the societies of the world that they come back to. So we've invested a lot of effort working on those areas, but also with public education on improving on a much more broader base the way that your education changes. So the British Council, who I have an enormous amount of time for, they're a wonderful organisation, have been working incredibly closely with the ministry on the education reform, educational policy, on English language teaching, obviously, on teacher training, on exams, on curriculum development, a whole host of different areas where we are one of the important countries who are supporting what you're doing, who are helping to influence the way that the minister wanted to transform his ministry. And I hope very much that will continue with the new public education minister. I don't see any reason why it
Но, тем не менее, нет
shouldn't.
такого ощущения, что у него не все получилось. Вернее, очень много что не получилось на этом посту. Потому что принципиально, как мне кажется, мало что поменялось в Министерстве народного образования. Ну, как...
We talked about transforming anything. Change takes a long time, and transforming an education system takes a truly long time to do. I think you can't just click your fingers, wave a wand, and suddenly you have a better school system. First of all, it needs a culture change. I think that the old ways of teaching, of a teacher standing in front of a class and giving a lecture which they were expected to write down and remember, is no longer appropriate for a 21st century world. But also you need to adapt a curriculum to change that. You need to train teachers differently. You need to change mentalities of institutions which have done things the same way for a very long time. And that really doesn't happen overnight. And I think what Minister Shermatov did was to start that process. You can do it in different ways, and I think the presidential school model is a nice model in a sense that you create a sort of model of how that might work and recruit a small number of people who can make it happen, and you also have a select group of young people who are benefiting from it. But it's only successful really if that then spins out to the rest of the community. So I think what Minister Shermatov did was to start a process which is really important. It will take more than one Minister of Education to see that through. I think there are still lots of problems. I think there's still, as everyone acknowledges, there's still a lot of corruption in the education system. It's still not providing, the quality education, 21st education, including through technology that any country needs. But we're all doing that. We're all learning that. In my own country, we probably don't value education as much as we ought to do, and you therefore don't get the truly talented teachers that you might do. And I think the presidential initiative alongside the minister to value teachers better is really important in all of that.
Я хотел вас спросить, как представителя страны, да, Великобритании, которая всегда, в общем-то, пытается построить везде систему. Поправьте меня, если я не прав. А мне кажется, что во всех вот наших реформах как раз-таки не хватает этой самой систематичности. Они как-то вот достаточно импульсивно проводятся. То есть поставили министра, перевели министра, поставили одного, убрали того. Он не успел одно доделать, приходит другой и так далее, и так далее, и так далее. То есть, может быть, в этом тоже есть причина того, что достаточно все тяжело идет, объективно.
What I see here is a country where you have an extremely ambitious, generally reform-minded leadership from the president downwards, but also at ministerial and deputy ministerial level, and indeed a lot of the business community also, who have a vision for the change that they want to see happening here, but sometimes struggle to implement that. And you see that in lots of different ways. We all see something is announced but takes a little while to happen, or happens much more slowly than it ought. And I suspect, though I don't talk personally to the president about this, is that's just as frustrating for him and for his ministerial colleagues as it sometimes is for ordinary people as well. But I think so. You need a system of an effective public service which can deliver on that reform, a parliamentary system which can support that process as well, that is providing its own impulse and its own sometimes checks and balances, but also sometimes the energy to a reform process. But I think as much as anything, it's creating a modern public service which can help to energise and implement some of the ambitions of the leadership. You started the question with the UK. I think we've had a much longer tradition of effective bureaucracy and of public service than has existed in this country, in a very different tradition. We are just as frustrated sometimes. I had a conversation with yesterday afternoon with a former permanent secretary, most senior civil servant in our energy department, who was, we were talking about a cross-government coordination, the way that one government department and one minister works on a common problem with others. And education's a really good example of that, but so is climate change, for example, that you need different bits of the government machine working together. And we struggle with that still in the UK. So it's not surprising that Uzbekistan is also wrestling with that.
В Европе тоже, на самом деле, большая бюрократия, насколько мне известно, не только у нас.
The size is not necessarily the problem. I mean, we'd all love small bureaucracies because it's a cost to an unproductive cost to the taxpayer. But sometimes you do need a strong bureaucracy. You do need a strong bureaucracy, and sometimes numbers are important in that. So the numbers themselves aren't the most critical thing. What you do need, though, is a bureaucracy that serves its purpose. And that's work in progress here.
Поговорим про экологию. Мы о ней часто говорим именно почему-то с представителями других стран, нежели чем с представителями своей страны. В ноябре жители Ташкента и некоторая часть Узбекистана столкнулись с пыльными бурями. Вы помните этот период, когда несколько дней была пыльно-песчаная мгла? Что вы делали в тот период? Вы в Ташкенте были, в Узбекистане?
Yes, I was here.
Как вы себя чувствовали в целом? Встречались ли вы с таким ранее? В Йемене, может быть, нет? В Ираке?
The dust storms I'm used to from Iraq, actually. It was there were times when dust was so thick it felt like the old-style London fogs, which don't exist in London anymore because we've tackled the air pollution that used to cause them. And that's a really important message, that you can do something about this. What was strange here is that it was unfamiliar. My Uzbek friends said, we're not used to this. This doesn't happen. This is something's changing. And maybe it's a good thing if it was a message that we have to take climate change seriously, if climate change is at the heart of this, that the world is, you're going to get more climate emergencies, more floods, more heavy winds, more freak temperatures, both high and low, and it's a fact of life. It's scientifically proven. We can do something to slow it down. We can do something to adapt, but it is a reality, and it's a reality we have to face, and that is very true here.
Ученые ООН выпустили недавно отчет, где было сказано, что к середине века Амударья, Ганг, Инд, они столкнутся с острой нехваткой воды. То есть, по сути, они могут обмелеть очень сильно. Засухи станут происходить на 20% чаще. То есть, я цитирую. Упадет урожайность, будет намного больше таких вот пыльных бурь. Узбекистан, Туркменистан неожиданно названы в регионе самыми уязвимыми странами. Какие советы вы могли бы дать властям нашей страны для того, чтобы, возможно, как-то немного исправить эту ситуацию? Основываясь на опыте Великобритании именно.
First of all, it's not for me to give advice. I think I'm not a climate expert, but I have views on this which are important. I think I'm going to start from, I will answer your question, but I'm going to start from a slightly different place.
Okay.
For the last 2.5 years, all the time that I've been here, I have been trying to discuss climate change here in a serious way. My observation is that there are people who want to talk about climate change here. It's not as big an issue as it is in Britain and in many parts of the world. I'm quite struck by that. It is not trying to get the media interested in climate change, trying to get conversations going with young people is not as easy here as it is elsewhere. And the default position is always to talk about the Aral Sea. So as soon as you start talking about climate change, you shift to the Aral Sea. I'm not saying that the Aral Sea is not important. It absolutely is. It is a symbol. It's a terrible symbol of what happens when we, mankind, mismanage our natural economy and our natural environment. And it is a disaster. It's a symbol of all of that. But it's not the whole story. And really isn't the whole story. And my message for a long time here, ever since I arrived, has been your biggest challenge now is what's happening in the mountains from which you get your water. Since the year 2000, the glaciers in the Pamirs, for example, have lost 35% of their volume in 20 years. Your source of water for your rivers is disappearing because of climate change. The Aral Sea disaster contributes to that because it used to have a cooling effect on the environment. It used to have a moderating impact on the environment here. The winds that you now see blowing through northern Uzbekistan are stronger because of what's happening with the Aral Sea. But there's not actually a huge amount. You can do things of course you can do important things, but actually this country needs to be helping the world to focus in other areas as well, and your water supply is the biggest thing. In terms of what you can do about it is, well, the world needs to be working together to try to tackle climate change, and Uzbekistan has a really important part to play in that. Message to politicians and young people and everyone is play your part. The second thing is that the issue of water is critical. You're already starting to see agricultural land no longer fit for use because there just isn't the water to be able to sustain it. And there are things that the world can be doing which slows down the global warming, which is eroding the glaciers, but actually there are things that individuals can do as well, that, you know, better irrigation practices in agriculture, for example, really, really important. Different use of crops, so using less water-intensive crops, which are sometimes of greater value, but certainly of equal value. And on that I'm absolutely not an expert, but it is one of the things that I constantly hear from scientists and others who are more expert than me. There are real things that Uzbekistan, alongside with everyone else, can be doing to ensure that we keep the levels of global warming down to manageable levels, meaning less than 1.5 degrees higher than pre-industrial levels. And that involves some really difficult choices on public transport, the use of cars, the way we use energy and electricity, the way that Uzbekistan and other countries produce their energy. And the shift to clean energy is really important, but we all need to be doing that. No, this isn't a criticism of Uzbekistan. The whole world needs to be shifting to solar, to wind, to hydrogen, to nuclear, to renewable sources of energy far faster than we're doing at the moment. But it's a mentality shift as well. I would not dream, living in London, of owning a car. Full stop. I do not need a car in London. It's a much bigger city than Tashkent, but I don't need a car because there is really good, environmentally friendly public transport, which allows me to get around. And that's much more, and that's a mentality shift. At the moment, ownership of a car is part of your, when I get on in life, I need to own a car.
Вы говорите очень о сложных структурных вещах, которые еще довольно далеки для осмысления нашим обществом на самом деле. То есть каким образом мы можем все-таки повернуть мысли общества, что это большая проблема, что рано или поздно нам это аукнется?
That's a really good question. You're right. A lot of the things that I've been talking about are big picture governance changes, though of course they have impacts on ordinary people's lives. So the way you use water is an issue for the simplest farmer in Surkhandarya or wherever. But I also think my starting point with all of this is young people, because it's the young people who will inherit the world in which we are now creating, so that helping young people to understand those challenges, but also to understand the challenge that you just set me, which is what can individual people do. Well, I think that a lot of this is taking responsibility for our own environment, so that, for example, a lot of we misuse energy. Well, that can have there are little things that all of us can do to save water, to reuse water, to save electricity. Just when you leave a room, turn the light off. When you clean your teeth, and you don't run the water all the time, you just turn it on and off. They're little things that, and kids are really good at that, because they understand that and they can educate parents. And so it's the little things that can make a difference. I think giving people pride in their communities, getting rid of plastic pollution, for example, stopping people using plastics as much as they do, stopping the supermarkets from over-packaging produce, for using plastic when you could use renewable or recyclable materials. Recycling is incredibly important. When I arrived here, it didn't exist at all. And even now, it's really hard if I want to recycle glass bottle or a jar or plastic, it's really hard. And that's crazy, because you can make money out of that. As the sort of the little bit of recycling at the moment is largely done by the gypsy communities here, and they're doing that for a reason. And that's great, but they should make it into a business and help. Just things like walking and cycling, rather than, this is a country which, Tashkent particularly, lends itself to cycling, and I did say that 2.5 years ago. You've got nice broad streets and space to be able to create cycle lanes. It's not going to be very long in Tashkent before you can get to work far quicker on a bicycle than sitting in your car in endless traffic jams with nowhere to park. But you need the infrastructure there to help that to happen. So get on your bike, save water, save electricity, use less plastic. And my final one, which is really controversial in this country, is eat less meat.
Очевидные вещи, мы об этом часто слышим, на самом деле, да, но мало решается это все. То есть, на самом деле, мало есть реальных шагов по внедрению этого всего. Мне кажется, может быть, имеет смысл проводить какие-то образовательные программы как раз-таки для министров, для министерств, которые принимают такие решения. Потому что вот об этом тоже был вопрос, про то, что, живя в Лондоне, вам не нужен автомобиль для передвижения. У нас, я себе очень плохо представляю, что какой-то из министров не на камеру, а просто будет на самом деле давать пример и ездить на велосипеде или откажется в какой-то момент от автомобиля. У нас это больше статус, это все и так далее, и так далее. Вопрос вот в чем. Может быть, имеет смысл как раз-таки образовывать людей, которые принимают решения? Может быть, это для нас какой-то такой челлендж, скажем так?
It's not for me to educate ministers.
Да, но мы просто общаемся. Ваше мнение, да.
But you know, that has to be a personal decision, and there are all sorts of reasons why you know, ministers and others might need a car. But you're right. I think leaders have to set examples, and that applies to a British ambassador just as much as the embassy doesn't have enough reach to be able to talk to the town planners, and but urban planning and the way you plan cities. It's incredibly important that you take these factors into account. So when you're planning a new community, yes, you do need to think about obvious things like, you know, are there enough schools for the kids that are going to be there? Are there health facilities? But public transport is vital in that. Is it linked to the rest of the city? Can you get in and out easily? Are the buildings constructed in a way that is environmentally friendly? I mean, there are fantastic techniques now on green buildings, astonishing technology to turn buildings into environmentally friendly green buildings, and so many things that you can do just to ensure that. That, for example, energy doesn't escape from buildings, that they're properly insulated, that they make best use of water. In Yemen, in our last embassy, we used to use huge amounts of what we called grey water. Is that there are things that it doesn't. Obviously, you don't use unfresh water for drinking. But for most uses, you can use it for, so you can incentivize those with tax breaks, for example. But also, you're right, your urban planners, your architects need to be aware of the new technologies and, again, incentivized to use them. You know, that takes government action, it takes education, it takes awareness, and it takes the kind of international dialogue that the embassy is there to foster. So we've got really good expertise on helping that to happen, which we're happy to talk through.
Ну, мы в Узбекистане решаем проблемы по мере их поступления, мне кажется. То есть, когда у нас реально прижмет, тогда мы и будем решать вопросы. Это наша такая, мне кажется, ментальная особенность.
You know your country better than I do.
Когда мы снимали интервью с Брисом Рокфеем, он был временным поверенным в делах Франции. Вы знакомы были с ним, Брис Рокфей?
Yes, yeah, of course, yeah. We work. It's a relatively small diplomatic community, and we all know others very well. And France is Britain's neighbour in Europe, but they're also very close by. I used to go walking with Brice in the mountains, often at weekends, because that's how I love to relax. So. Yes, of course.
В нашем интервью он говорил, что ему очень страшно ездить в Ташкенте. В частности, в 2021 году на дорогах Узбекистана погибло почти 3000 человек. Это очень большая цифра. Как вы себя чувствуете в качестве водителя или пешехода на наших улицах? Вы водите сами?
Yes. Yeah, I don't enjoy driving here. I would prefer not to drive anywhere because, as I said, I prefer to be using public transport, or I cycle lots. I used to cycle to work in London, not least because it was the quickest way of getting to and from, even over quite long distances, because it was just speedy and, of course, it's healthy. But I don't enjoy driving here. I know Brice had quite strong views about this, but I find Uzbek driving quite aggressive. It's not my favourite way of
Как
getting
можно
around the
изменить
city.
ситуацию?
All sorts of things can happen. I think road design is part of that. I haven't come across the U-turns in the middle of dual carriageways in any other country in the world, which is quite scary. That's urban planning. Again, there are other ways of designing your road network that you don't have to stop in the middle of the fast lane of a busy road to turn across the traffic. I think that driver education is really important, and that's something that I gather that the government is now starting to do something about. Enforcement of speed limits is important. You see a lot of police on the streets, but not a lot of evidence that the speed limits are being enforced. People drive very fast and seemingly without sanction. Dangerous driving, again, it's not just speed, it's the way that people drive, so you could do something about that. I think, sadly, one of the things that will change behaviour is that the volume of traffic gets bigger and bigger and bigger, so that driving fast will not be an option anymore, but what you will do is get the sort of the aggressive manoeuvring that you see already. So I hope it changes. I hope it changes for the better. There's no reason why it shouldn't.
Урбанисты и наши средства массовой информации часто критикуют государство, что они принимают такие решения без обсуждения с общественностью. Как в Лондоне обстоят дела с этим? Решения, я имею в виду, по планированию городов или по какой-то там застройке или перестройке. Как в Англии, в Британии решают такие вопросы?
Civil society has an incredibly strong role in urban planning, road safety, and all those sorts of community issues, because they are largely community issues. We have strong road safety organisations. One of the first civil society organisations that I ever became aware of as a primary school child was an organisation called ROSPA, which is the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents. 60 years ago, there was an organisation that was working to stop accidents, and they would do practical things like where there was a school where people were coming out of schools, they would put traffic calming measures, that they would put traffic lights that would allow children to cross the road at safe points at school times. So, practical measures that could be put in place by local authorities, by the police, and they would ensure proper enforcement as well. And civil society plays an incredibly strong role in that. Our planning processes, our urban planning processes, down to the simplest thing, if you want to do an extension on your house, there is a transparent, open planning process that you have to make an application, that is publicly scrutinisable, so that your neighbours can go and look at what your plans are and say, we don't like this because for the following reasons. And that is particularly, the bigger the planning, so if you want to reuse what is residential zone, for example, for business use, there would be a big public debate about that. That is sometimes difficult for us. So that, for example, we have been trying to expand London's airport facilities for decades now. And civil society action has slowed it down because it's such a controversial, such a difficult issue. So sometimes it's difficult, but it does mean that you get generally better decisions as a result.
Ну вот, мне кажется, это замкнутый круг, когда Я примерно представляю, о чем думает правительство, какие-то части в этом ключе, что мы сейчас будем работать с общественностью, это очень долго, а нам говорят, нужно сделать очень быстро, а общественность, на самом деле, пока все это вы найдете какие-то консенсусы, пройдет время и так далее, и так далее, и так далее. Может ли быть это одной из причин того, что у нас просто нам же нужно быстрее сделать, нам нужно быстрее построить, отчитаться и так далее, и так далее. Насколько эта система правильна, по-вашему?
The London airport example was perhaps not a good one because that does take a very long time. But generally speaking, your planning processes don't need you. Of course, you need to act quickly, but that's true in Britain just as much as it is here. You just make sure that people are aware that the planning process is happening, that you hold public meetings which allow people quickly to discuss things, that you have a limited time that people have to answer, and that you have a process which allows the scrutiny of those responses speedily afterwards. That's a matter of weeks, but it's also a matter of strong communication, that everything is clear, both sides are listening.
Иногда это невозможно.
Not just in Uzbekistan.